Namaste, blessed love and peace. This is a 1 hour walkthrough of the Gospels, part dos. That includes Mark, Luke, and John. In part uno, we provide a walkthrough of the Gospel of Matthew. And in there we provide further details about the general narrative that's shared in Matthew. A lot of it is repeated, particularly within Mark and Luke. And so the intention with this session is to look less in detail in terms of the things that are repeated or that are already stated in Matthew, and to look further at the unique portions within Mark and Luke and within John, which is also considerably different than all three. The preceding three. So that is the methodology, and we get into it. God willing. Bismillah ar-Rahmani ar-Rahim. Allah wabha. Dao ke dao fei cheng dao ming ke ming fei cheng ming ja Rastafari. Deus nos te quies in cele sanctificita nomen tuum, vaheguru sanam. Baruch ata Elohim, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kasanu b'am tzadav v'tzivan l'sok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Kyrie eleison, sivamastu savajikatehi, sabe sata bhavantu sukhitata. Vagabiyam, aquaba upendo na amanim, fikiri nesilami, chinta dam permean, lebov me, umajika. Ubuntu shabona fikitka. Session, como sunida, domo arigato, pilama yela wakatoka, tokodoku shingu, go manigan. God, we thank you for all that you bless us. Ata jamia yata afanami. Medo, ho, om shanti, shanti, shanti. Amen. Mark is the most brief of the four Gospels. 16 chapters, I think. So, Luke has, I think, 24. And John has 27, I think. Actually, John only has 21. 21. Luke has 24, and Mark has 16. So, here we go. Mark, the Gospel according to St. Mark. Again, chapter 1 begins by stating the gospel of Jesus. And actually, it references prophecy of Isaiah, and then describes John the Baptist. So there's different chronological sequence in terms of the material that's shared within Mark compared to Matthew. The ministry of John the Baptist is described in further detail, continuing into verse 8. And it describes Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. And again, when he emerges, it describes in verse 10, he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son, with thee I am well pleased." And then again, Jesus is tempted by the devil and ministered by angels. And then it's described in the next verse, John being arrested and Jesus proclaiming the gospel of God. Simon and Andrew, otherwise known as Peter and Andrew, arrive and meet Jesus, and Jesus brings him as his disciples. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, also are established as disciples. And it states in verse 21, and they went to Capernaum, and immediately on Shabbat he entered the synagogue and taught. So all of this is established very much in the first chapter of Mark. In Matthew, it takes a number of chapters to get through this entirety of the sequence, but here all in chapter 1. Jesus heals a man with an unclean spirit. And then it says in verse 28, and at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding regions. And again, Jesus goes into the house of Simon Peter and heals his mother-in-law. And it says that evening at sundown, so lay down, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered together about the door. So he's getting a lot of notoriety very quickly, and he says he describes to his disciples the necessity of going to another town, going to Galilee. Leper, he heals a leper, and again Jesus says to him in verse 44, chapter 1 still, that see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moshe commanded for a proof to the people. And instead it says in verse 45, but he, the man who was cleansed, went out and began to talk freely about it and spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. So right here, and that concludes chapter 1. And right here already, we see that Jesus gives an instruction after providing the healing, and the person directly abrogates that, directly breaks that instruction, and instead just says, begins to spread the news loudly. And because of that, Jesus was already getting a lot of attention. Now he's getting further attention, so he has to go out into the country, and even then, still people follow him. He returns, and it's reported that he's home. So again, people return. We're in chapter 2 now. Here's one episode that is not within Matthew, where there's a paralytic, and there's so many people around the house that the friends who are carrying him on a pallet and open up the roof of the house because of the crowds, and then lower the paralytic into the house so that he can be healed by Jesus. So Jesus heals him. And again, sins are forgiven. And Jesus brings in additional disciples, some with different names. He's addressed by first questioners asking why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus responds, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And that's an interesting distinction between the lambasting that Jesus provides in the beginning with St. Matthew. Because Jesus says that it's those who have that knowledge who are not being righteous. So a little bit of a different response here. Not incongruent, but a certain distinction. And then again, Jesus asks, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus talks about, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? Again, Jesus is responding with descriptions concerning the distinction between the behavior of his apostles and those of other teachers. There's the parable, or there's the scenario of walking through the grain fields during Shabbat, and Jesus responding accordingly. And that concludes chapter 2 into chapter 3. He entered into the synagogue, and he heals the man with a withered hand. And Jesus actually is rather pronounced. So immediately, rather than responding to the critics repeatedly as it is described in Matthew, here, after just the brief interaction, or just the brief chapters which have a lot of chronology within it, he addresses his critics directly, and he says to them in chapter 3, verse 4, is it lawful on Shabbat to do benevolence or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So already in chapter 3, we're already into that scenario of contention between Jesus and the authorities. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea with a great multitude from Galilee, and a great multitude from Galilee followed. So we're already having this migration and this following. That's this chapter 3, verse 7, verse 7 there. Continuing to heal through chapter 3, Jesus provides Simon the name of Peter, and continuing on. And the names of his disciples are provided here in chapter 3. It says again in verse 19 through 20, then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family... So again, continuing arrival of crowds looking for healing. And here there's something interesting that's saying from as pronounced within the Gospel of Matthew, is his interaction with his family and what his family says about him. It says in verse 21, and when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for people were saying he is beside himself. So there's further explicit description of his family attempting to intercede, and discounting Jesus, dismissing his works because of the scrutiny and the criticism that he's receiving from the leaders. Later in chapter 31, it says further concerning that relationship, and his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside they sent to him and called him, and a crowd was sitting about him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around on those who sat about him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and more. That concludes chapter 3. Getting into a boat, again, providing the parables. The sower who had seed that fell on the different types of soil. He explains and translates the parable to his disciples, and then he provides. Here's when he begins some of the teachings that are included within the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7 in Matthew. Here it is included within chapter 4, after already providing some of the parables and healings, and additionally now we hear some of the teachings from the Sermon on the Mount. Is a lamp brought in to be put under a bushel or under a bed, and not on a stand? For there is nothing hid except to be made manifest, nor is anything secret except to come to light. That's looking at verse 21 through 22. Gives another parable, and so the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount from from the Gospel of Matthew are interspersed amongst additional teachings here within Mark, giving the parable of the seed that grows without the man knowing how, and then again the parable of the mustard seed. So we're having these agrarian parables being interspersed amongst the explicit teachings about the sovereignty of heaven. And again, we have at the conclusion of chapter 4, Jesus calming the winds in the sea, and his disciples being amazed. Chapter 5, we have the man who has the of Gerasenes, who is the legion, who is described as legion in Matthew, that Jesus heals. Actually, I should be accurate. This is described as, and when he come out of the boat, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who lived amongst the tombs, and no one could bind him any further, even with a chain, for he had often been bound with fetters and chains, but the chains were he wrenched apart, and the fetters he broke into portions, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Yeah, okay, so it does say, my name is Legion, it says later in verse 9. And so it is the same scenario. And so it's the same sequence of being sent into the pigs. The One of the lead rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, fell at his feet and besought him, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death." So one of the leaders of the synagogue, one of the authorities, is asking for healing for his daughter, which is rather logical, although may seem contradictory to the approach of other leaders. But when one's own family is in emergency need, then people have the way of, parents particularly have the tendency of seeking the help, even amidst the protocols of convention. And again, the woman touches the garment of Jesus, and Jesus recognizes it. This particular description goes into further detail compared to within the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew. And then also the healing of the daughter of the ruler is in further detail. It describes Jesus taking out the everybody who doubts and says that she's already dead, but only brings in his select of his disciples and the parents, and heals the girl, and he gives her something to eat. And that concludes chapter 5. Again, he teaches during Shabbat, and people ask, where does he get this wisdom? And again, he says, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and amongst his own kin and in his own house. And it says that he's unable to do mighty works there because of the doubt concerning him. And then this is where it is described that he takes his 12 disciples and sends them out 2 by 2 and gives the direction accordingly. And again, we're still in chapter 6. And in this part, it is there's the description of King Herod and hearing of Jesus, and it is here revealed where that John is beheaded. So there's an absence of a narrative. It's just basically an indirect reference based upon what Herod proclaims, saying that he already beheaded John. So he's trying to figure out. Herod is trying to figure out who Jesus is and what the nature of this threat to his authority is. And then it goes on to explain the scenario where Herod had beheaded John the Baptist. And then the apostles returned to Jesus and describe what they had done. And Jesus responds to them and says in verse 31, "And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." So again, we can see like the conditions of just continuing ways of people just looking for healing and not even considering like, okay, y'all need to take a break. So it's beneficial to recognize that. Commentary on low right now. And even then, when trying to go to a lonely place, many were following where the boat was going on foot. And again, Jesus provides the thousands of people with only a few loaves of bread. And again, going into the boat, Jesus approaches, walking on the sea, and it's the same narrative that's shared within the Gospel of Matthew, and that concludes chapter 7. Now we see the Pharisees, and beginning to question them again, eating with unwashed hands. And again, Jesus responding directly about the hypocrisy of not abiding by the letter of the law, not abiding by the spirit of the law, and only the aesthetic of the letter of the law. So then a woman arrives and asks Jesus for healing for her daughter. And it says here in verse 26 in chapter 7, "Now the woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter." And he said to her, "Let the children first be fed, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, master, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this saying you may go your way, the demon has left your daughter." So a little bit of a condescending response, recognizing a certain difference of standing and perspective concerning those in the fold and those outside the fold, but at the same time, responsiveness as well, albeit amidst a self-deprecating response from the one outside the fold. And Jesus continues to heal in concluding chapter 7. Again, Jesus feels the crowd. We're into chapter 8. Jesus feeds the crowds with only a few loaves. Jesus heals a blind man. And at first, when he lays hands upon him, he says he can only see the things that look like trees. The people look like trees, and he heals them further, and then he can see directly. And Jesus begins to describe what is to come in terms of his persecution. Peter says, "Never, never, never." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, because you are not on the side of God, but of men of this earth." So again, this is what is described in the Gospel of Matthew. And it is here, continuing into chapter 9, that Jesus provides further description about the approaching conditions, circumstances. He goes to the mountain again with Peter and James and John, as it is described in St. Matthew, the Gospel of St. Matthew. And Jesus explains to his disciples what occurs on the mountain. He returns. His disciples aren't able to heal a child, and he heals them. And he says it's because of the child is healed by faith. This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Again, it says concerning the rivalry amongst the disciples. What were you discussing on the way? But they were silent, for on the way they had discussed which one another who was. They had discussed with one another who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but God who sent me." Somebody asked Jesus about another man casting out demons in Jesus' name, and Jesus says, "Do not forbid him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able to soon after to speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is for us." So, interesting protocol of diplomacy. And again, we have some additional teachings that are included within the Sermon on the Mount here about salt. Salt is beneficial. Salt is benevolent, but if the salt has lost its saltness, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. And now in chapter 10, he is asked by the Pharisees again about divorcing wife. And he provides the same response. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Another questioner asks him about eternal life, and Jesus again provides the same response in terms of affirming: do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father, and more. And then again, it's the rich man with great possessions. camel and the eye of the needle. Again, the sons of Zebedee ask to be at the right hand and left hand, and Jesus says it is for God to decide. There's a blind man who becomes indignant, and even after his disciples warn him to be quiet, he gets louder, and Jesus stops and heals him. And that concludes chapter 10. And now, already in chapter 11, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And again, he's welcomed on the colt, on the path. Again, goes to the fig tree. Goes into the temple and clears out the money exchangers. He's asked about by what authority he's doing these things, and he provides the same response about authority concerning baptism from John the Baptist. And that concludes chapter 11. Chapter 12, chapter 12, begins sharing parables about the sovereignty of heaven. And here's one about Caesar giving tribute. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So that is a response to one of the challenges. And then another challenge from the Sadducees about which husband is the wife's upon the resurrection, and Jesus saying that all are like angels. And then again, the question about what is the greatest commandment. And the questioner actually agrees with Jesus and affirms what Jesus responds concerning the love, to love God with all one's might and with all one's heart and with all one's soul and with all one's mind and with all one's strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. Jesus provides the description about the poor widow putting in a penny, 2 copper coins, which make a penny, and that being much further than all the many contributions that the others provide, because she's providing out of her poverty. In chapter 13, Jesus talks about the great buildings eventually being thrown down, and provides his disciples with further description about the ministry upon his crucifixion and resurrection. And in chapter 14, we have the approach of Pesach, the Passover, and again, Jesus provides the description about the approaching betrayal and assault, and it occurs as Jesus describes. We're in chapter 14 still. And Peter denies him 3 times. Chapter 15, 15, is the trial of Jesus. He's put before Pilate. And again, it is the same scenario. And it is described in verse 37 of chapter 15, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. In chapter 16, we have, after Shabbat, the experience of the resurrection, and the angel describes the rising of Jesus, and he is reunited with his disciples, and he gives further instruction to his disciples concerning the continuing ministry. So, and that is the conclusion of Mark. And going into the Gospel of Luke, it is chapter 1, just straight into it. It is actually addressed to an individual named Theophilus. So this is written in the second person, but it continues in a very similar narrative. So it first begins with the days of Herod, in verse 5. And actually it begins with a narrative of relatives of Jesus, Elizabeth and Zechariah, who is a priest, and the two have a child after a period of barrenness, and that child is actually John the Baptist. So that is the beginning of chapter 1 with Zechariah, Elizabeth, and the pregnancy of with John the Baptist as a babe in the womb. In the same chapter 1, there is the description of the angel visiting Mary and describing to Mary her having a child, even though she has yet to be married with Joseph, to whom she is betrothed. And there is the description of her kinswoman, Elizabeth, who is also conceived with a son at the point of 6 months in her pregnancy. And Mary accepts the guidance from the angel and goes to visit Zechariah and Elizabeth. And so there's affirmation between the two about everything that both experience. And so eventually John the Baptist is born and is named John the Baptist, or John at that point. And that concludes chapter 1. And chapter 2, there's the decree of Caesar Augustus of the enrollment of all. And Joseph goes to the city of Bethlehem to be enrolled. And that is where Jesus is born. There's reference to the wise men. And the wise men visit and from that interaction, Jesus is then brought to Yerushalayim, as is the custom prescribed by the Torah, and so there is a man referenced as Simeon, and provides further description about the prospect of Jesus. There's another prophetess named Anna who also provides proclamation concerning Jesus as well. So these are things that are absent from Mark and Matthew as well. And also there is a fast forwarding from that point. It says in verse 40 in chapter 2, and the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. And then fast forward in that one verse 12 years. Now his parents went to Yerushalayim every year at the feast of the Pesach, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And so it goes on to describe on the way back, he stays in the temple, and his parents lose sight of him and have to go back and find him. And so that is what concludes chapter 2, chapter dos. And now it describes the 15th year, chapter 3, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, describing the political conditions within Israel during that period. We again see John the Baptist preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And so there's further details concerning the proclamations that John the Baptist provides in his consultation with people of that time. And Jesus also arrives in verse 21. Now all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form as a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son, with thee I am well pleased." That's chapter 3, verse 21 to 22. And then it says here, and Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. And it's from here that actually the lineage of Jesus is provided. So in Matthew, it's provided at the beginning. Here, it's provided at the conclusion of chapter 3. And then from that, then in chapter 4, it describes Jesus being tempted by the devil for 40 days in the wilderness. And Jesus proceeds through that. And returns and begins his ministry here. In Nazareth, he goes to the synagogue and reads during Shabbat. And again, this is something unique in Luke, where describing the portion of the readings that he states from the front of the synagogue. And he makes a proclamation about himself and the prophecy that he just reads being fulfilled. We're in chapter 4 still. And so Jesus talks about the anticipation of the critics towards him, about physician, heal thyself, and additionally, and he provides further references about similar circumstances amongst the prophets before him. He goes to heal a man who experiences an unclean spirit, and that spirit pronounces Jesus, saying that that spirit knows who Jesus is, and Jesus heals the man. And again, scrutiny emerges because of that. And again, it describes him at verse 42, and when it was day, he departed and went into a lonely place. And the people sought him and came to him and would have kept him from leaving them. But he said to them, I must preach the benevolent news of the sovereignty of God to the other cities also, for I was sent for this purpose. So he continues on. That concludes chapter 4. And it is in chapter 5 that we see his meeting with Peter, the apostle, and he becomes Jesus' apostle. Peter first asks him to leave because Peter proclaims himself as a sinful man, but Jesus summons him. The sons of Zebedee also, Jesus brings into his discipleship. And Jesus continues to clean. This is again chapter 5. So there's a little bit of a distinction in terms of sequence compared to Matthew as well as Mark. He sees additional disciples and brings his disciples into his discipleship. And he's asked also about fasting, and he again provides direct response comparing new wine and new wineskins. Chapter 6 is where we see again on Shabbat the grain fields, and Jesus responding to the critics accordingly. And it's here where we see the naming of the disciples, and from that, then we see the Sermon on the Mount, all in chapter 6. So it's the naming of the disciples, and then it's the beginning of the Beatitudes here, that we also see in St. Matthew, the Gospel of St. Matthew, beginning with verse 20 and continuing on. And right after the Beatitudes, an abbreviated version of the Beatitudes, we also see the woe to those who are causing harm. So we also see, but I say to you that here, love your enemies, do benevolence to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Later on in chapter that's verse 27. And then later in verse 37, we see, judge not, and you will not be judged, condemn not, and you will not be condemned, forgive, and you will be forgiven, given, it will be given to you. Beneficial measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. Verse 37 to 38 gives them the parable of the blind leading the blind, seeing the speck that is in your brother's eye, and not the log in one's own eye, the benevolent tree bearing benevolent fruit, doing the works rather than just proclaiming the words. And that concludes chapter 6. And then it says again, that's the conclusion of the gospel, the conclusion of the effective Sermon on the Mount as rendered within the Gospel of St. Luke. Chapter 7 begins with him healing the servant of the centurion, as we see previously in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus heals a young man who was perceived as dead. John the Baptist sends his disciples to ask about Jesus, and Jesus responds by saying, see for yourself. The people are healed. And Jesus proclaims again, affirms the ministry of John the Baptist, and describes what the nature of that ministry is. Here we have one of the Pharisees inviting him to eat, and at the place, a woman who is a sinner provides a flask of ointment, and the Pharisee who invites him sees it and says, if that man knew who was a prophet, he would know what type of woman that is who is touching him. And then so Jesus tells Simon Peter a parable about forgiveness, and Jesus relates that parable to the critic who is questioning why he allows the woman to touch him. In chapter 8, Jesus continues going through the villages, preaching benevolent news of the sovereignty of God. And further disciples follow him. He provides the parable of the sower in the field upon the different soil, benevolent soil on rocks and and on amidst the root, amidst the thorns. He provides the translation of the parable to his disciples. He is told about his mother and his brothers waiting for him, and he proclaims to them, those who do the word of God are those who are his family. Continuing on to the boat, looking for another place, experiencing the challenges of the elements, and he calms the elements. Arriving at the other side, he is approached by the man with demons amidst the tombs, otherwise known as Legion, and cast into the swine. When the townspeople see that, they ask him to leave. Because they were fearful of what Jesus was doing. The man who was healed asked to go with Jesus, and Jesus refuses and says, go home and return and declare how much God has done for you. And so it's interesting here because verse 39 here in chapter 8, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. And it says later, and he went away proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. So again, we see that duality about what Jesus says and how people respond. The ruler of the synagogue asks for the healing for his daughter. The woman with the flow of blood is healed, similarly as is declared in previous Gospels. In chapter 9, he gathers his 12 disciples and gives them power and authority over the demons and to cure diseases. And again, he gives the instructions that he does previously in the previous Gospels. When they return, they go to a lonely place again. The crowds follow him. He feeds the thousands with a few loaves. He goes up the mountain with Peter and John and James. An argument arises later amongst his disciples about which is the greatest, and Jesus responds with what he states before about whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives God who sent me. For he who is least amongst you all is the one who is great. That is looking at verse 48 of chapter 9. And here is at concluding chapter 9 is here where we see that that description about Jesus' pragmatics, verse 58. Actually, verse 57, as they were going along the road, a man said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. In chapter 10, Jesus appoints 70 disciples and sends them 2 by 2, and gives them the instructions about approaching the houses, and again, the protocols of economics and accordingly. They return and rejoice about the success of their works, and Jesus provides further guidance. Later it says here again, still in chapter 10, it says a lawyer stands up to put him to the test. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And then Jesus turns the question back to him. What is written in the law? How do you read? And the lawyer responds by stating the same thing that Jesus provides in Matthew and Mark. And Jesus says, you have answered right. Do this and you will live. That's verse 28. But the lawyer is unsatisfied and tries to further test Jesus and asks, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replies and gives the parable of the benevolent Samaritan, the man who was accosted by robbers, and the people who are of his own brethren, the priest and the leader, and additionally just walk by and do nothing, whereas the Samaritan, who was a stranger, who was even a rival, enemy, stops and heals him. So which of them proves to be the brother, the one who attends to him? Excuse me. Um, Here we have the interaction of Martha and Mary. He's in the house, um, and in the house of Martha, who is hosting him. Her sister is sitting and listening to the teaching, and Martha is doing all the work, preparing the hospitality herself, and asks Jesus for her to help him, for her to help her. And Jesus says that Mary is receiving the benevolent portion, and it won't be taken away from her. And that concludes chapter 10. In chapter 11, here is where we have the Lord's Prayer. His disciples ask him how to pray. And Jesus talks about the giving of benevolent gifts again. People know how to give benevolent gifts to their friend, to family, and God will give benevolent gifts to those who work in the way of God. And again, Jesus gives a rebuking of the generation not seeing the signs after the healing is done. Gives further description or inclusion that's included in the Sermon on the Mount in in Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount, as it is described in Matthew, here we're seeing one of the teachings in this sequence, which is, no one after lighting a lamp puts it in a cellar or under a bushel, but on a stand, that those who enter may see the light. Your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eye is sound, your whole body will be full of light. But when it is not sound, your body is full of darkness. Again, he's asked about eating without washed hands, and he talks about the hypocrisy. And a lawyer, after hearing that response, also says that feels slighted, and Jesus also describes the hypocrisy amongst the lawyers, and references the ill deeds that the predecessors, preceding generations, are done, and how the inheritors of authority are guilty of those abuses. And chapter 12, Jesus talks about the leaven of the Pharisees, the pride of the Pharisees, the hypocrisy. And here's where Jesus talks about the importance of aligning with the nature of heaven, worrying less about the trappings of the earth. Someone asks Jesus to help tell his brother to divide the inheritance with me. Jesus says that he is not the one to provide that type of judgment, and again emphasizes inheritance within the sovereignty of heaven. Again, much of this is what's included previously in the Gospel of Matthew within the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus provides further metaphor concerning the parable of the benevolent servant staying righteous whilst the master is away, and that being described as the experience of heaven, and being righteous even whilst it seems the authority, the heavenly authority, is absent. The faithful servant. And again, Jesus describes, "Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division." Same explanation as within the Gospel of Matthew. Chapter 13 begins with referencing some of the persecution that is being experienced amidst the faithful. Jesus provides a parable of the fig tree requiring further attendance because in order to bear fruit. Additional healing Jesus provides. And here we see again the parable of the grain of mustard seed, compared to the sovereignty of heaven, like leaven in flour and dough that multiplies, describing the sovereignty of the path as a narrow door. And again, the description of those workers of iniquity who make the proclamations but do not practice the deeds and provide the fruits of the wisdom. Chapter 14, Jesus heals a man during Shabbat again. Jesus shares the parable of taking the modest seat when being invited to a marriage feast. Do not sit in a place of honor, but sit in the lowest place to be promoted within the eyes of the attendants. To be generous in inviting others who are otherwise destitute when offering a feast. And Jesus provides a parable to that effect. Again, reference to the salt is benevolence. Concluding chapter 14. Chapter 15, chapter 15. Jesus is described as conversing, of connecting with the tax collectors and sinners, and is accused of that. Jesus gives the parable of the man losing one sheep out amongst 100 and rejoicing in finding that one sheep. And here we receive the specific parable that is exclusive to Luke, which is the parable of the prodigal son, who receives all his inheritance, spends it up in loose living, and leaves the land and becomes impoverished, and then returns to his father, thinking that his son was dead, but now he finds his son is alive and rejoices. The other son, who didn't do any of that, who worked every day, is jealous because his father is making this feast for the returned son who spent out all his inheritance. His father affirming him that the other son, that he does receive everything, but it is appropriate to rejoice because the son that had left was thought as dead and now has returned. And that concludes chapter 15. Chapter 16 is the parable of the stewards. The steward whose stewardship was being taken away, and decides to negotiate deals with those who owe his master money or items in order to gain favor with those who have those debts to his master, um, and making shrewd preparations for his being fired. Jesus provides another parable of Lazarus, um, who is sickly in this earthly life and full of sores, and another rich man who is feasts sumptuously every day. And when the two pass from this life, Lazarus, who is united with Abraham Avinu, whereas the rich man is languishing in pain. And so Jesus provides us as a warning away from the foils of excess. And that concludes chapter 17. Jesus talks about temptations, and warns kinfolk against falling into temptations, and even further from hindering others, and imposing temptations upon others. Later in chapters 17, 17, there are 10 lepers in Samaria, between Samaria and Galilee. And Jesus heals them as they're walking away. They notice they're healed, but only one returns and praises God in providing thanks for being healed. And Jesus talks about that one being the only one who does that. The one foreigner is the one, the Samaritan is the one that provides thanks. Jesus provides another parable about the sovereignty of heaven. And that concludes chapter 17. Chapter 18 begins with another parable. The judge who refuses who doesn't care about the law but is harassed by a woman, and it's only because of the harassment that he accedes to the woman, to the elder widow. There's also the parable of the two who are praying at the altar. One is a rich man a Pharisee who gives thanks for all the little things that he does and receives, and there's a tax collector who just beats his breast, his heart, and confesses of being a sinner and asks for repentance. And Jesus saying, it is the man who truly humbles himself that is exalted. And again, the ruler asks of Jesus about what he shall do to inherit eternal life. Jesus affirms the parables again, and again, the man turns away because he's very rich, and Jesus gives the degree of the camel through the eye of the needle. And here in chapter 18, Jesus talks about the approach towards Yerushalayim. There is in chapter 19, there is the episode of Zacchaeus, who is a tax collector. He cannot see Jesus walking along the road, and so he climbs a tree. Jesus tells him to get down and to host him because he needs a place to stay. And Zacchaeus talks about the benevolence that he shares. Jesus provides the parable of the three servants who are given different portions to invest, and one does not invest it because he perceives his master as being unfair, and so his master rebukes him for that unfaithfulness. And then later in chapter 19, he goes into Yerushalayim on the colt. Goes into the temple. He is asked about by what authority he's doing these things. He also asks the question back, and he gives the parable of the man who planted vineyard and lent it out to tenants. And when the man went to receive his tribute from the tenants, they treat the men he sends shamefully. And this is a comparison to the sovereignty of heaven. Then he's also asked about providing taxation to Caesar. And Jesus says, render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's, and to render unto God the things that are God's. And then he's asked about the husband and wife and the brothers who also married the same wife. And Jesus again says that all are like angels. And then Jesus provides a question in return concerning David and how David can call the Moshiach his own master, who's supposed to be his own descendant, and there's an absence of a response accordingly. And Jesus warns about the conventional protocols of salutations in the marketplaces and the seats of honor, and additionally, but instead looking for genuineness and recognition from heaven through righteous works. Again, he sees the widow putting in 2 copper coins. This is chapter 21, and talks about how much she is providing because she's providing out of her poverty. He begins to just talk about of the days to come, and still in chapter 21, and prepares his disciples for the circumstances after the crucifixion and resurrection. Chapter 22, we have the Pesach, the Seder, and his consultation with his disciples, the betrayal provided from Judas, and Jesus provides a distinctive, adjusted direction to his disciples. And again, chapter 22, verse 35, he says, "When I sent you out with no purse or bag or sandals, did you lack anything?" They said, "Nothing." He said to them, "But now let him who has a purse take it, and likewise a bag. Let him who has no sword sell his mantle and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me." And he was reckoned with transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, "Look, Master, here are 2 swords." And he said to them that it is enough. So we have a distinctive direction compared to preceding directions, and the necessity of reconciliation amongst that distinction. Continuing congruence in understanding and reconciliation, though. And actually, it's articulated here, again, still in chapter 22, as it is in previous Gospels, where Jesus prays to God. This is when he after the Seder of Pesach, he goes and asks God for the cup to pass him, but not his will be done, but that God's will be done. And it's here where his disciples are sleeping because of fatigue, and it's then when he is betrayed, and the crowd arrives to assault him. When he is seized, his disciples flee. Peter denies him 3 times, and then weeps bitterly. And Jesus is brought before the trial, and is condemned in the conclusion of chapter 22. Chapter 23, he is brought to Caesar, or he's brought to Pilate, the representative of Caesar, and it is the formal trial, and this is where he is crucified. He is condemned by the crowds before Pilate, and he is crucified accordingly. And again, still here in chapter 23, it says in verse 44, it was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, whilst the soleil's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Creator, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. His body is taken by Joseph and laid into the tomb. On chapter 24, it is the first day of the week after Shabbat. His disciples arrive at the tomb, and they are told by the angel that the reunion is approaching, and there's a somewhat of a distinct narration. It's a little bit further involved here in Luke compared to Matthew and Mark. Jesus returns to his disciples on a number of different occasions, and so the women first hear this from the angels, and that the same day, two of the disciples are walking along a path and are approached by a stranger. They don't recognize who it is. They have a conversation about what has just happened, and the stranger explains everything. And when he does this, it is revealed that it is Jesus, and they are awakened, and they receive further ministering, and there's another occasion where he appears on he shows them. He shows his apostles his hands and his feet, as evidence of his resurrection, and he breaks bread with them, and then provides further direction about how to continue in the ministry. And it says here, chapter 24, verse 50, Then he led them out as distant as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. Whilst he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. And they returned to Jerusalem with great joy and were continually in the temple blessing God. That is how the Gospel of Luke concludes. We're going to conclude the session here because we're at an hour at this point. So we have yet to get into the Gospel of John, and that will be part 3, God willing. So that concludes this session of part 2 of Mark and Luke. Alhamdulillah, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allah wabham, dao ke dao fe chong dao, min ke min fe chong min, ja Rastafari. Deus nos tekies in cele santa fakito nomentum, vaheguru sanam. Baruch ata Elohim, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher gzalnu b'mitzvotav v'tzivoну l'sok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Kyrie eleison. Sivamastu savajagatahi. Sabe sataba vantu sukitata. Vagabiyam. Quaba upenda na amani. Fakiri na salami. Chinta dan permen. Liba of me wumajika. Umbuntu shabana fakitka. Shishin. Kamosanina. Damo argato. Pilama yellow waka. Toko dokoshin. Good man again. God, we thank you for all that you bless us. Ata jame yatafanami. Mado. Shanti, shanti, shanti. Amen. All thanks and praise to the Most High Elohim. Blessed love and peace, respect and honor to all our ancestors, all our prophets, all our sages, past and present, known and unknown. Respect and honor, blessed love and peace to His Majesty Haile Selassie I and Her Majesty Waiza Romanan. Blessed love and peace in Rastafari to all brethren and sistren and kinfolk of earth and universe. One perfect love. Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. Ado.